listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Gulseth.
Today we conclude our series in the battle for the Augsburg Confession in 19th century America with Dr. MacKenzie. As always, when we conclude a series, I'm a little sad.
I know.
But I have enjoyed this series thoroughly, and we have more to learn today. And we're going to talk about the Synodical Conference and some of the synods that made up the Synodical Conference. Today's episode of The Coffee Hour is underwritten in part by Concordia University, Nebraska. You can learn more about Concordia University, Nebraska by visiting cune.edu. Joining us today, the Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie. He's the Forrest E. and Francis H. Ellis Professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Dr. MacKenzie, welcome back.
Thank you. It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
We have covered a lot in this series. We've talked about all kinds of things that contributed to the development of synods and the characteristics of various synods and church bodies in North America, 19th century America. Where do you want to pick up today to wrap up our series?
Let me start with just a little bit of a reminder of where we've come in American Lutheranism from where we started this series. We began it in the early 80s with the observation that for a lot of Lutherans, Lutheranism wasn't much more than the name, and not even that in all cases, but that through the course of the century, more and more Lutherans came to realize that what made Lutherans Lutheran was not their ethnicity, although that was definitely a part of it for some people, but not their ethnicity, but their doctrine. What did they teach about God, man, our relationship, and especially what did they teach about the saving work of Jesus Christ? And these truths were articulated back in the 16th century in a series of documents, the first of which was the Augsburg Confession. And through the course of the 19th century, more and more American Lutherans came to be familiar with that Augsburg Confession and to embrace it for themselves as their own statement of what they believed, what they confessed, and what they taught. So, as a whole, the 19th century, people looking at it who sometimes despair that things can ever get better should realize, well, in the 19th century, they actually did get better in terms of acknowledgement that what made Lutherans Lutheran was what they taught in accordance with the Augsburg Confession, and then subsequently with the rest of the Book of Concord. Where we are today is kind of at the end of this story. After a confessional revival occurred in the big National Lutheran Church body known as the General Synod, that ultimately led to a split and to a new group, one fully committed to the Augsburg Confession, the Book of Concord, that is the General Council. And then the decision by many synods, particularly in the American Midwest, that the General Council had absorbed from the past lots of erroneous practices in terms of fellowship, in terms of belief in participation in secret societies, millennialism, etc. And so a concern arose from the Midwest Lutherans that they needed a national Lutheran church body, which was committed not only on paper to the Augsburg Confession and the rest of the Book of Concord, but also in practice, that if we're going to enjoy true fellowship with each other in various synods, we had to agree on both the doctrine and the practice. And that conviction led to the creation of another church body, the one which we call for short the Synodical Conference, but which was the joining of the evangelical Lutheran church bodies who agreed in doctrine and practice to form this national church body. Now, we talked a little bit last time about how the Missouri Synod dealt with the prospects of fellowship, and that was by meeting with representatives of other synods to actually explore whether their doctrine was the same and whether their practice was the same. The actual idea for beginning a synodical conference came actually from the Ohio Synod. Missouri had met with them in 1868 and had reached a kind of an agreement with them on doctrine and practice. And so the Ohio Synod wanted to take the next step. And so they invited not just the Missouri Synod, but representatives from other church bodies to meet and to talk about whether they couldn't formalize their theological agreement in a national Lutheran church body. So it was in July of January of 1871 that the first meeting took place, as a result of which they adopted a constitution and began this Evangelical Conference of Lutheran synods here in America in July of 1872. The first members of that Synodical Conference included not only the Ohio Synod and the Missouri Synod, but also the Wisconsin Synod, the Minnesota Synod, the Illinois Synod, and the Norwegian Synod. Now, the Norwegian Synod is kind of new to our conversation here, so I thought by way of getting us into the Synodical Conference, we should say a word or two about the Norwegian Synod. So let me do that right now. Scandinavians, including the Norwegians, started coming to America in the middle decades of the 19th century. They're a little bit later than the Germans in coming in large numbers. But by the time we get to 1870, there were about 300,000 Norwegians in America and 100,000 Swedish immigrants in America. They settled primarily in the upper Midwest, Illinois, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Wisconsin, Iowa, that part of the country. And they brought with them their state religion. And that state religion was Lutheran. Now, the Swedes basically formed one church body. It was known as the Augustana Synod on account of its deeply held commitment to the Augsburg Confession. And the Swedes in their Augustana Synod did join and remain members of the General Council. That was one of the church bodies we talked about previously, the more confessional half of the East Coast Lutherans. Well, the Swedes in the Augustana Synod belonged to the General Council. The Norwegians had a number of different synods representing different strains of Norwegian Lutheranism, but among those, the one that was perhaps most important for our purposes was the Norwegian Synod. The Norwegian Synod had begun in the East by just a handful of pastors and congregations who wanted to have a church body that represented the kind of Lutheranism that the state church had represented in its best moments back in Norway. So they met, and there were about 4 or 5 pastors there, and they adopted a constitution and decided that they would have their first convention in 1851. The Constitution specified, and here I'm going to quote it because it's kind of interesting, the doctrine of the church is that which is revealed through God's holy word. Sounds okay so far, but listen to this. In our baptismal covenant and also in the canonical books of the Old and New Testaments. What does that mean in our baptismal covenant? A little weird. So at any rate, the next...
my question too.
So, and there is more history on that, which I'm not going to bore you with, but nonetheless, a little weird. So the next year, when they were going to have their first convention, a new arrival from Norway, a pastor, attended, and he said, this doesn't make any sense. We're committed to the Bible, not this baptismal covenant idea. And so they, in effect, started over. They adopted the Constitution, which now read, through God's holy word, in the canonical books of the Old and New Testaments, interpreted in agreement with the symbolical writings of the Church of Norway. Now, the man who was instrumental in effecting that change for the better and putting this new synod on a strictly confessional basis was a man by the name of Preuss, Hermann Amberg Preuss. And he was a direct ancestor of the Preuss family that has become so prominent in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, including J.A.O. Preuss, who was president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod from 1969 to 1981. The confessional heritage of Hermann Amberg Preuss came to be manifested, other than in the Norwegian Synod, by actually in the Missouri Synod, where we still have a lot of Preusses who are active, solid, good Lutheran pastors, and for which we praise God and thank Hermann Amberg Preuss for his arrival in America. Anyway, this group started in 1850, small group concerned about the future, was looking around for where and how they could train their men for the ministry. And they decided to explore various other options. And one of the things that they did was to send representatives to visit the Seminary of the Ohio Synod, the Seminary of the Buffalo Synod, and the St. Louis Seminary of the Missouri Synod. And it was the Missouri Synod that they felt themselves most compatible with, and which they decided to try to use for the training of their own men. And so what they did was to propose that they would call one of their men to serve on the faculty at St. Louis, where his specific responsibilities would include particularly teaching and caring for Norwegian students who would come there. And this was agreed upon in the late 50s, and the Missouri Synod thought this was a great idea and welcomed the Norwegians into their fellowship. And I'll just read a little bit here because it helps us understand the idea behind fellowship by the Missourians and Norwegians and others at this period. It was the president of the Synod in those days, Preacher Wieneken, who wrote, "Where faith and confession are united, as God had already at the time of the Blessed Reformation brought it about in both your and our native lands, there language and descent cannot erect barriers between us. Well then, precious and dearly beloved brethren, we accept the proffered hand of fellowship and give you ours in the joyous certainty that by means of continued fraternal communication between our two groups, we will increasingly recognize, strengthen, and put into action our unity in spirit and in doctrine. We hope that the appointment of a Norwegian professor to our college in St. Louis will also prove to be a blessed means for this unity." So this was 1857, 1859, the professor began. Now, there was a disruption because of the Civil War, but after the Civil War, right at the time of the establishment of the Synodical Conference, that professorship was renewed in 1872, existed for a handful of years, and then finally in the late 1870s, the Norwegian Seminary began their own seminary. But the relationships between the Missouri Synod, the Norwegian Synod, went back to that early period well before the establishment of the Synodical Conference. But it made sense then that when the Synodical Conference came along, Norwegians would kind of automatically be included in those discussions as well.
I think we can take our break right here and jump back in. We are talking with the Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, Professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne. You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
Are you looking to gain practical insights and spiritual encouragement in a format that fits your life? Discover the treasures of Christ-centered learning with Concordia University, Nebraska. Utilizing an online, self-paced learning platform, Concordia Nebraska's new Studia Vitae program will offer a non-credit continuing education courses featuring lifelong learning opportunities in a variety of focused areas. Courses begin in January 2026 and registration opens soon. Learn more at cune.edu/CEU. That's cune.edu/CEU.
Welcome back to the Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
We're talking with the Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, Professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in our final episode of the Battle for the Augsburg Confession series, which has been so great. We are talking about the Synodical Conference. And before we went to break, you were telling us the story of the Norwegian Lutherans. Where would you like to go from here?
Well, let's go back to then those first members of the Synodical Conference. As I said, they consisted of Ohio, Missouri, Wisconsin, Norwegian, Minnesota, and Illinois. Some of those, of course, don't exist anymore, so their story becomes a part of the story of other church bodies. But for our purposes here, I want to talk a little bit about what they were going to do as a Synodical Conference. First of all, it was a group to which synods themselves belonged. And the synods joined by committing themselves to the doctrine and practice of the Synodical Conference. But in terms of programs and policies, the Synodical Conference was only advisory to the member synods. So if the Synodical Conference decided on a mission plan, that was one of the things that they wanted to do together. The other thing they wanted to do together was educational endeavors. But if the Synodical Conference embarked upon a mission program, that decision was not binding upon any of the member synods until the member synod actually embraced it for itself as well. So it was an advisory body. However, from the beginning, there were some who thought that it would be a good idea if the Synodical Conference would simply become a step to the reorganization of confessional Lutheranism in America, whereby instead of having in some places competing synods, say, for example, in the Milwaukee area, where you already had Missouri Synod congregations and Wisconsin Synod congregations, why should we have like two organizations here, not necessarily in competition, working at perhaps at cross purposes at time? So there was some thought right from the beginning that synods ought to be reorganized. This was particularly something that Walther and the Missouri Synod thought was a great idea. And actually, one of the consequences of that decision was the fact that the Illinois Synod went out of business by becoming a district synod in the Missouri Synod. So that was a first step toward maybe reorganization of Lutheranism. I also want to mention here, in terms of this new church body, that the Wisconsin Synod, which today we think of as the kind of most conservative of the Lutheran church bodies here in America, had not always been particularly confessional in its history. It had begun in the East by representatives of mission societies from the Old World, but mission societies that were unionistic, that sent either Lutherans or Reformed, didn't matter which particularly, over here to America. And its first representatives, who made it all the way to Wisconsin, decided that the Missouri Synod was too confessional for them. The Buffalo Synod, which was also represented, was too confessional. So they developed their own synod, which would be less confessional. But that changed in part because more confessional people arrived in Wisconsin and joined the Wisconsin Synod, and also because of the impact of the confessional revival that the Missouri Synod was a part of, as was the Ohio Synod and indeed the General Council. So the Wisconsin Synod changed through the course of the 1860s. They made confessional subscription a requirement for membership. And then they did something which I think was really quite courageous. They had received a lot of support from the mission societies that had sent their pastors. And the Wisconsin Synod basically decided that they could no longer take that financial support because it came from a group that was not in agreement with the Wisconsin Synod in doctrine and practice. So they gave up that financial support, including monies that had been collected for a new seminary. But they thought that was the right thing to do rather than to take the money and not use it in accordance with what the societies who were sending it wanted to, or the other way around, to take money from non-confessional Lutherans and then use it for themselves. So anyway, they became more confessional. They gave up the money, and after being in the General Council for a short period of time, became some of the first members of the Synodical Conference. So the Synodical Conference was this group of synods. They were going to perhaps reorganize into district synods. They're also going to coordinate their educational programs. The Norwegian Synod would have their own synod for Norwegians. The German Lutherans would have their own synod for Germans that would have been in St. Louis. And then the English-speaking Lutherans would attend the Ohio Synod Seminary in Columbus, Ohio, because of all of these synods that we're talking about, it was the Ohio Synod that really had significant numbers of English-speaking congregations, and they always had and would continue to have. So Synodical Conference has these ambitions. They're going to have difficulty realizing them because a controversy is going to break out less than a decade after they're founded. But we're not really going to have time to talk about that. Maybe we can do it in another series sometime. But there is one program that I wanted to make sure that we did have time to talk about because it was just shortly after the founding of the Synodical Conference that the members undertook a very important mission. And this mission had to do with the African Americans, formerly slaves, who had now become freed in the Old South, but to a large extent were left spiritually destitute. They didn't have a lot of churches, didn't have a lot of pastors, didn't have opportunities for education. And so the Synodical Conference decided to send a missionary down south, kind of using New Orleans as a basis for that work. The first man was a short-termer, but the next man was a Norwegian, Niels Bakke, B-A-K-K-E, and he started schools, and from the schools, he started churches, so that New Orleans, during the course of the last couple of decades of the 19th century, ended up with 3 churches that were African American, and from there, the movement would continue to expand. I know in some of your programs you've talked about Rosa Young, who was from rural Alabama, concerned with having schools for the children of her background in Alabama. And she tried to get some help from Booker T. Washington, who said, well, why don't you contact the Missouri Synod? They're all about schools. And she did. And the Missouri Synod, instead of not responding, responded, put her in contact with Bakke. And before you knew it, we had schools and congregations in rural Alabama. So this was a Synodical Conference mission to the freed Black people of the old Confederate South, many of whom then had opportunities for Lutheran education and Lutheran confirmation and becoming a part then of our Lutheran Church. So that was the Synodical Conference at the beginning. And one other thing I'll just quickly squeeze in here, and that was, it was also in 1872 when the Synodical Conference started that Walther made contact with a few English-speaking Lutherans in the Ozarks and met with them and helped to organize them into an English conference that became an English synod, that became the English district of the Missouri Synod, 1911. So all of that was going on at the same time. Synodical Conference, missions, reorganization of synod, seminaries, and this effort to start an English-speaking Lutheran church body.
Looking back over the 8 episodes of the history of the battle for the Augsburg Confession in 19th century America, have you learned from this? What do you want us, if you were to sum it up, wrap it up and put a bow on it, what would you like for us to learn from this, or one thing that you'd like for us to walk away with?
Well, I think just a reminder that what makes us Lutheran is our commitment to the Scriptures as confessed and explained in our Book of Concord, in which the charter document really is the Augsburg Confession. If nothing else really matters, we can do whatever language, whatever skin color, whatever, as long as we are united in what we believe, and that belief is centered on the saving work of Jesus Christ, which we receive through faith, articulated so beautifully in those Lutheran confessions. So that, for me, would be the bottom line. Lutheranism means Lutheran doctrine, Lutheran practice, faithfulness to the Scriptures and the Book of Concord.
Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, the Forrest E. and Francis H. Ellis Professor of Historical Theology, Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne. Dr. MacKenzie, thanks for doing this series with us. I always learn a lot. Man, I've learned so much, and now I want to know what happens next.
Maybe we'll need another series.
But we know you have classes to teach.
Yeah,
so
right.
We'll let you do that.
We'll give it some thought. It'd be fun. Sure, right.
Thank you so much, Dr. MacKenzie.
You're
this
welcome.
Has been fantastic.
I really do enjoy it with you guys, so thanks for having me. It was great.
You've been listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Golseth.
The Coffee Hour with Andy and Sarah is a production of KFUO. To support the Coffee Hour and KFUO Radio, visit kfuo.org. You can also text KFUO to 41444 or send an email to gifts@kfuo.org. And you can call us at 800-844-0524. KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere.